There is a famous photograph, though not of the moment itself. The photograph shows a street in Turin, Piazza Carlo Alberto, on a winter morning, cobblestones gleaming with recent rain, the buildings rising in their elegant Italian symmetry, balconies adorned with wrought iron, the morning light slanting across the facades. But the photograph cannot show what happened there on January 3, 1889. It cannot capture the sound of a horse crying out, or the crack of a whip against flesh, or the moment when a middle-aged German man with an enormous mustache stumbled forward, threw his arms around the animal's neck, and collapsed weeping into the street. The photograph shows only the space where it happened, the ordinary continuation of the world after something extraordinary and terrible has occurred. The street remains. The buildings remain. The life of the man who collapsed that morning would continue for 11 more years, but in a sense profoundly important, it ended there on those wet stones in Turin. Before we go further into that January morning, into what happened and what it meant, I want to ask you something simple. If you're finding value in these explorations of history and ideas, if this kind of deep dive into a life and its consequences resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more people find these stories, and it lets me know that this work, these long, careful attempts to understand the past, matters to you. There's a like button below as well, and clicking it takes only a moment but makes a genuine difference. Now, Turin in the winter of 1889. Friedrich Nietzsche had been living there since the previous September, renting rooms in a boarding house at Via Carlo Alberto No. 6, high up on the 3rd floor. He had come to Turin partly for his health. He was always chasing health, always fleeing the cold and damp that aggravated his headaches and eye problems and digestive troubles, and partly because he found the city beautiful and affordable and, crucially, relatively free of Germans. He could walk the long arcaded streets without encountering the culture he had come to despise, the culture of his birth, the culture he believed was killing everything worth preserving in European civilization. He walked every day, weather permitting, long walks that were part of his discipline, part of the routine that kept his ruined body functional enough to think and write. He ate simply, almost monastically. He avoided conversation. He worked when he could, when the pain in his eyes permitted, when the headaches receded enough to allow concentration. He was finishing a manuscript called Ecce Homo, an autobiography that began with the chapter, Why I Am So Wise, and proceeded with the kind of grandiose self-assessment that might seem like madness except that in many ways it was simply accurate. He was writing philosophy that would reshape Western thought, though he had no way of knowing this because almost no one was reading him. The morning of January 3rd was cold but clear. Nietzsche left his lodgings to walk as he usually did. The streets of Turin are beautiful in any weather, but especially so in winter light, when the Baroque architecture seems to glow with a kind of golden warmth against the gray sky, and the arcades provide shelter from wind and rain, and the mountains are visible in the distance, the Alps rising in their impossible grandeur. He walked through the Piazza Carlo Alberto, a square not far from his rooms, a place he must have passed through dozens of times before. There was a horse there, a cart horse, the kind of heavy, patient animal used to pull wagons through city streets, and there was a driver, a coachman who was beating the horse. We don't know exactly why. Perhaps the horse had refused to move. Perhaps it had stumbled. Perhaps the driver was simply cruel or drunk, or angry about something unrelated and taking it out on the animal he controlled. The details are lost. What we know is that Nietzsche saw this. He saw the horse being beaten and something inside him broke. He ran toward them. This middle-aged man, this invalid philosopher who spent his days in careful, controlled routine to manage his failing body, ran across the cobblestones and threw his arms around the horse's neck. He was weeping. He may have been speaking, though we don't know what he said. The driver must have been bewildered. Passers-by stopped to watch. Nietzsche clung to the horse and then he collapsed. People helped him back to his lodgings. His landlord, Davide Fino, was alarmed. This strange, quiet German tenant who paid his rent on time and caused no trouble was now incoherent, weeping, unable to explain what had happened. Over the next hours and days, Nietzsche's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would sing loudly. He would dance. He would shout. And he began writing letters, strange letters to people he knew, signing them with names that were not his own. To Cosima Wagner, the wife of the composer Richard Wagner with whom Nietzsche had shared a complicated and ultimately broken friendship, he wrote, Ariadne, I love you. He signed it Dionysus. To his old friend Jacob Burckhardt, the historian, he wrote a rambling letter that began, Dear Professor, and ended with Nietzsche declaring himself to be both Dionysus and the crucified one, the pagan god and the Christian victim, somehow both at once. Burckhardt, deeply disturbed, forwarded the letter to Nietzsche's friend Franz Overbeck in Basel. Overbeck recognized immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. He took a train to Turin, arriving on January the 7th. He found Nietzsche in a state of complete mental disintegration. The man who had written with such precision and force about the death of God, about the revaluation of all values, about the necessity of becoming who you are, was now singing fragments of songs, declaring himself to be various historical and mythological figures, laughing and weeping by turns. Overbeck arranged for a doctor to examine him. The doctor recommended immediate institutionalization. Overbeck took Nietzsche back to Basel by train. Imagine that journey. The train moving through the winter landscape, the Alps giving way to Swiss valleys, Overbeck sitting beside his old friend who was now unreachable, locked inside a mind that had turned against itself. Nietzsche may have looked out the window at the passing scenery. He may have been calm or agitated. We don't know. What we know is that in Basel he was admitted to a psychiatric clinic, and from there, after a few days of observation, transferred to a clinic in Jena, Germany. The diagnosis was uncertain. Some doctors suggested tertiary syphilis, the final stage of that disease which attacks the brain and nervous system. Others thought it might be inherited mental illness. His father had died young of what was described as a brain condition, possibly a tumor, possibly something else. Still others speculated about the effects of all the medications Nietzsche had taken over the years for his various ailments, the chloral hydrate for sleep, the opiates for pain, the various remedies that may have done more harm than good. No one knew for certain. What was certain was that Friedrich Nietzsche, at the age of 44, had ceased to be Friedrich Nietzsche in any meaningful sense. The mind that had produced Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that had declared God dead and proposed the Übermensch, that had traced the genealogy of morals and attacked Christianity and sought to philosophize with a hammer, had fragmented. Over the following months he would have brief periods of something like lucidity, but they became rarer. Mostly he sat in silence or played simple melodies on the piano, or spoke in fragments that made no coherent sense. After about a year in the Jena clinic, his mother took him home to Naumburg, the town where he had grown up after his father's death. She cared for him there as one would care for a child, feeding him, dressing him, walking with him. He lived this way for 11 more years, a body continuing while the mind had fled, until he finally died in August of 1900. But the effective end came in that plaza in Turin, when he wrapped his arms around a suffering horse and broke. There's a question that haunts anyone who studies Nietzsche's life and work. Did his philosophy lead to his madness? Did thinking these thoughts, pursuing these ideas, challenging every foundation of Western morality and religion and philosophy, did it break him? Or was it simply that his body, which had never been strong, which had been racked by illness from young adulthood onward, finally gave out, and the madness was biological, medical, nothing to do with the content of his thought? The question can't be answered definitively. But it's worth holding in mind as we trace backward from that collapse, through the life that led to it, through the ideas that emerged from that life, because the trajectory has a terrible logic to it. This was a man who pushed himself to think without limits, who refused all comfort, who looked at what he believed to be the truth no matter how harsh, and who ended in the most complete form of silence. But to understand how he arrived at that plaza in Turin we need to go back. Back before the wandering years, before the books that almost no one read, before the professorship and the friendship with Wagner and the discovery of Schopenhauer. We need to go back to the beginning, to the house where he was born, to the certainties of childhood, to the faith that he would spend his life dismantling. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the village of Rocken in Saxony, a part of Prussia. The house where he was born was a parsonage. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, and the family lived in the house that came with the position, a solid structure that embodied respectability and religious devotion. The world of a pastor's family in mid-19th century Prussia was one of certainty. The Bible was not a book among books but the book, the revealed Word of God, the foundation of all morality and meaning. The church calendar structured time. Prayer structured days. The community looked to the pastor for spiritual guidance, for interpretation of Scripture, for comfort in times of suffering. It was a world that knew its place in the cosmos, that understood suffering as part of divine plan, that saw death not as ending but as transition to eternal life. Friedrich was named after the Prussian king Friedrich Wilhelm IV, whose birthday he shared. It was a common practice, this naming of children after royalty, a gesture of loyalty and patriotism that bound the personal to the political. The parsonage in Rocken was surrounded by fields, by the rural landscape of agricultural Saxony, by a pace of life that followed seasons and harvests. The village itself was small, a few hundred people, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where the church stood at the center literally and figuratively. Friedrich's father was a cultured man, musical, given to playing the piano and composing small pieces. There was music in the household from the beginning, and the child who would become the philosopher was also a child who loved music, who would throughout his life turn to music as refuge and inspiration. But when Friedrich was 4 years old, his father began to suffer from headaches and vision problems. The symptoms worsened rapidly. Within months, Carl Ludwig Nietzsche was dead at the age of 35. The official cause was given as softening of the brain, a diagnosis that meant very little in the medicine of the time but suggested something neurological, some deterioration of brain tissue. It might have been a tumor. It might have been an infection. It might have been something else entirely. Friedrich was too young to understand fully but old enough to remember. His father, the center of the household's world, the representative of God on earth in the small cosmos of Rocken, was gone. The following year, Friedrich's younger brother Joseph also died, at only 2 years old. The household was shattered by these losses, and it was also financially precarious. The parsonage was tied to the position, and with no pastor, the family could not remain. In 1850, when Friedrich was 5, the family moved to Naumburg, a larger town about 15 kilometers away. The household that settled there consisted of Friedrich, his younger sister Elizabeth, his mother Franziska, his maternal grandmother, and 2 of his father's sisters. It was a household of women, and it was a household saturated with religious piety. The faith that structured their lives was Lutheran Protestantism of a particularly earnest and devout kind, the kind that saw daily life as service to God, that understood hardship as trial, that found comfort in scripture and prayer. Friedrich grew up in this atmosphere, in rooms where the Bible was read aloud, where hymns were sung, where grace was said before meals, where Sundays were kept sacred. He was a serious child, studious and intense, given to reading and to music. His schoolmates called him the little pastor because of the way he would recite biblical passages from memory, the way he carried himself with a kind of premature solemnity. The schools he attended in Naumburg provided a classical education, the kind that emphasized Latin and Greek, that introduced students to the ancient world of Rome and Athens. But alongside this classical learning was religious instruction, thorough and unquestioned. God was as real as grammar. Christ's sacrifice was as factual as Caesar's campaigns. The moral framework was absolute: good and evil, heaven and hell, salvation and damnation. There was no ambiguity. And for young Friedrich, this framework seems to have been sincerely accepted. He wrote devotional poetry. He composed religious music. He seems to have genuinely believed, or at least he had no reason not to believe. The world made sense within this framework. His father's death was tragic but comprehensible as part of God's mysterious plan. His own existence had purpose as a soul created by God for eternal destiny. But there were other elements in his childhood as well. There was music, which provided a different kind of transcendence, one that didn't require theological explanation. When he sat at the piano and played, or when he heard music performed well, there was an experience of beauty and meaning that existed on its own terms. And there was the slow introduction to ancient Greece and Rome through his studies, the beginning of an awareness that there were other ways of understanding the world, other frameworks for meaning that predated Christianity, that had nothing to do with the God of the Bible. These were seeds that would grow later, but in childhood they coexisted peacefully enough with the religious certainty of the household. The streets of Naumburg were cobbled and narrow, winding between buildings of timber and stone, buildings that had stood for centuries. The river Sala flowed nearby. Church bells marked the hours. In autumn the trees turned golden and then bare. In winter snow covered the roofs and muffled sound. Spring brought the return of green, the budding of trees, the longer days. Friedrich walked these streets on his way to school, carrying books, perhaps thinking about the lessons ahead, perhaps simply noticing the world around him. The play of light on stone, the sound of a cart passing, the smell of bread from a bakery. Childhood is often remembered as a kind of paradise in retrospect, but for Friedrich it seems to have been something quieter than that, something more earnest and dutiful. He was not a carefree child. He was careful, conscientious, aware even then of doing things correctly, of living up to expectations. When he was 13 he was admitted to Schulpforta, one of the most prestigious schools in Prussia, a boarding school with a history going back to the 16th century, a place that prepared boys for university and for leadership in church and state. Getting into Schulpforta was an achievement, a recognition of academic promise. It was also, for Friedrich, a departure from the household of women, an entry into a world of male discipline and classical learning that would shape the rest of his life. The school was located in a former Cistercian monastery, and it retained something of that monastic atmosphere. The buildings were ancient and imposing, the routines were strict, the curriculum was rigorous. Students rose early, attended chapel, studied Greek and Latin texts for hours each day, memorized vast quantities of poetry and prose, learned mathematics and history and theology. The discipline was meant to form character as much as intellect, to produce young men who were educated in the classical tradition and committed to service. Friedrich thrived academically. He was brilliant at languages, quickly mastering Greek and Latin to the point where he could read ancient texts with fluency and write competent compositions in both languages. He was introduced to Homer, to the Greek tragedians, to Plato and the pre-Socratics, to Virgil and Cicero. These texts opened up worlds, the world of the Iliad and the Odyssey, of heroes and gods and fate, the world of Athenian tragedy, where human beings struggled against forces beyond their control, the world of philosophy, where fundamental questions about reality and knowledge and the good life were pursued with relentless logic. He began to see that the ancient Greeks had thought about the world in ways very different from Christianity, that they had asked questions and proposed answers that didn't fit neatly into the theological framework he had grown up with. But he was also, during these years at Schulpforta, beginning to experience the health problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. He had severe headaches, migraines that left him unable to work for hours or days at a time. He had eye problems, extreme sensitivity to light, difficulty focusing. He had digestive troubles. Some of this may have been psychosomatic, the physical expression of psychological stress. Some of it may have been the beginning of whatever organic disease would eventually destroy his mind. Regardless of cause, the effect was that from adolescence onward, Friedrich Nietzsche lived with pain. He learned to work around it, to use the good hours when they came, to rest when the pain was too severe. But it was always there, a constant companion, a reminder of bodily vulnerability. He formed friendships at Schulpforta, particularly with Paul Deussen, who would remain a lifelong friend and later become a scholar of Indian philosophy, and Karl von Gersdorff, with whom he shared musical interests. They formed a little society, calling it Germania, where they would share their writings and musical compositions. Friedrich wrote poetry, essays on historical and literary topics, and he composed music, small piano pieces in the Romantic style. Music was refuge and passion. He loved Beethoven especially, and later would encounter Wagner's music, which would overwhelm him with its power and ambition. But in these school years, music was simpler, a space where emotion could be expressed without words, where beauty could be experienced directly. The physical environment of Schulpforta was austere. The stone buildings were cold in winter, heated inadequately by fireplaces and stoves. The dormitories were Spartan, rows of beds with minimal privacy. Students wore uniforms. Meals were plain. The emphasis was on discipline, on sacrifice of comfort for higher purposes. It was a training in endurance as much as in classics. And there was the religious component, always present. Chapel services were mandatory. Theology was part of the curriculum. The assumption was that these young men would go on to serve church or state, that they were being formed into Christians and Prussians, the two identities inseparable. But for Friedrich, something was shifting. The ancient Greeks had lived without Christianity, had created works of astonishing beauty and depth without the Bible, and their worldview was in many ways incompatible with Christian doctrine. They had celebrated the body in ways Christianity condemned. They had accepted fate in ways that contradicted free will. They had understood the gods as capricious and multiple, not as singular and benevolent. The more he read, the more this tension became apparent. And then there was the simple matter of intellectual honesty. As he read the Bible with the same critical attention he brought to Homer or Plato, questions arose. The contradictions in the text. The historical problems. The moral difficulties. A God who commands genocide, who punishes the innocent, who demands Abraham sacrifice his son. These were not new questions. Theologians had been wrestling with them for centuries. But for a young man of Friedrich's intelligence and honesty, they were troubling. The easy certainties of childhood were becoming difficult. By the time he graduated from Schulpforta in 1864 at the age of 19, he had received one of the best classical educations available in Germany. He could read Greek and Latin as easily as German. He had memorized huge portions of ancient literature. He had written accomplished essays on philological topics. He was ready for university. But he was also, though perhaps not fully aware of it yet, ready to leave behind the faith of his childhood. The little pastor was becoming something else, though what exactly he could not yet have said. He enrolled at the University of Bonn in the autumn of 1864, officially to study theology and classical philology. The plan, presumably shared by his mother and family, was that he would follow in his father's footsteps, become a pastor himself, take up the role of spiritual guide in some parish. It was a respectable path, a natural extension of his upbringing and education. But from the beginning the theological studies felt wrong. He attended lectures on the New Testament, on church history, on systematic theology, and found them increasingly hollow. The methods seemed to him dishonest, starting with the conclusion that Christianity is true, and then arranging the evidence to support it. When he applied to the New Testament the same kind of critical analysis he applied to Greek texts, the problems multiplied. The Gospels contradicted each other. The historical claims were dubious. The theology seemed arbitrary, built on assertions rather than arguments. Within a year he had abandoned theology entirely and transferred his focus solely to classical philology. This was a significant decision, one that effectively meant giving up any possibility of following his father into the ministry. It must have disappointed his mother and the rest of the family. It meant accepting a degree of financial uncertainty, since academic positions were scarce and poorly paid. But intellectually it was necessary. He could not continue studying theology without violating his own sense of honesty. If the text did not support the claims, if the arguments were unconvincing, then he could not pretend otherwise simply because it would be convenient or expected. This commitment to intellectual honesty, to following the evidence wherever it led even when it led away from comfort, would become central to his identity. It was the beginning of the path that would lead him to declare God dead, but at this stage it was simpler. Just a young man deciding he could not be a pastor because he could not believe what a pastor must believe. He transferred to the University of Leipzig in 1865, following his professor Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the leading philologists in Germany. Leipzig was a larger city than Bonn, more cosmopolitan, and the university was excellent. Friedrich plunged into his studies with characteristic intensity. He worked on ancient Greek texts, particularly on the pre-Socratic philosophers and the Greek tragedians. He wrote papers that impressed his professors with their scholarly rigor and originality. He was clearly brilliant, clearly destined for an academic career if he wanted one. But it was also in Leipzig in the autumn of 1865 that he encountered the book that would change his life. He was browsing in a used bookshop, the kind of place students frequented looking for cheap editions of books they needed for courses or simply for reading. He noticed a volume he hadn't heard of before, The World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. He picked it up, perhaps read a few pages and decided to buy it. He took it back to his rooms and began to read. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Here was a philosopher writing in clear, forceful German, not the obscure jargon that characterized much German philosophy, but direct, powerful prose. And the content was even more striking. Schopenhauer argued that the fundamental reality of the world is not reason, not divine order, not progress toward any goal, but blind, irrational will. The will to live, which manifests in every organism as the drive to survive and reproduce, is not purposeful or benevolent. It simply is a ceaseless striving that can never be satisfied because satisfaction would mean cessation, and the will cannot cease. Life, therefore, is fundamentally suffering because desire is suffering, and life is nothing but desire. The satisfactions we achieve are brief and partial, and they immediately give way to new desires, new lacks, new sufferings. This was pessimism as a philosophical system, a view of reality that denied all the comforting stories of progress and meaning and divine providence. Schopenhauer looked at the world and saw not God's creation but a cosmic mistake, a reality that would be better off not existing. The only escape, the only path to peace, was the denial of the will to live, a kind of asceticism that quiets desire. He drew on Indian philosophy, on Buddhism and Hinduism, to support this vision of liberation through renunciation. And he attacked the optimistic philosophies of his time, particularly Hegel, for what he saw as their dishonest attempts to justify reality, to make suffering make sense. For Schopenhauer, suffering didn't make sense. It just was. Honesty meant acknowledging this. For Nietzsche, reading this was a revelation. It articulated something he had felt but hadn't been able to express. The Christian framework said suffering is punishment or trial, that it serves divine purposes, that it will be redeemed. But this didn't match experience. Suffering seemed arbitrary, excessive, meaningless. Schopenhauer said this directly: suffering is fundamental, not accidental. The world is not a place of justice or order. It's a place of blind striving. This was terrifying and liberating at once. Terrifying because it removed all consolation. Liberating because it felt true, and truth, even harsh truth, has its own kind of beauty. Nietzsche read and reread Schopenhauer. The book became his companion, his secret education running parallel to his official studies in philology. He absorbed the pessimistic worldview, the critique of optimism, the emphasis on art and music as temporary escape from the horror of existence. It shaped how he thought about ancient Greece, how he understood tragedy, how he began to develop his own philosophical perspective. But there was something else happening in Leipzig as well, something that would have an equally profound impact. In November of 1868, Nietzsche met Richard Wagner. Wagner was already famous, a controversial figure in German culture, known for his massive operas that attempted to fuse music and drama into a new art form he called Gesamtkunstwerk, total artwork. He was also known for his nationalist politics, his anti-Semitism, his enormous ego, and his magnetic personality. He was visiting Leipzig, and through a mutual acquaintance, Nietzsche was invited to meet him. The meeting took place at the home of Wagner's sister, and Nietzsche was immediately captivated. Wagner was everything Nietzsche was not: confident, commanding, worldly, successful. He spoke with authority on art, politics, philosophy. He had a vision of cultural renewal through art, particularly through his operas, which he believed could restore something of the grandeur and spiritual depth of ancient Greek tragedy to modern Germany. And his music. Nietzsche had encountered it before, but hearing Wagner talk about it, understanding the theoretical ambitions behind it, deepened the experience. This was not just music. This was philosophy expressed in sound, myth made audible, the Dionysian force that Schopenhauer talked about channeled through organized sound. Nietzsche became almost instantly a disciple. He visited Wagner at his home in Tribschen, a villa on Lake Lucerne in Switzerland, and these visits became regular occurrences over the next years. Wagner treated him as a brilliant young man worth cultivating, and Nietzsche treated Wagner as a genius, perhaps the genius of the age, the artist who would redeem German culture. There was a father-son dynamic to the relationship, though it was never stated as such. Nietzsche's actual father had died when he was 4. Wagner was older, powerful, a figure of authority and creativity. The attraction made psychological sense, though it was also intellectually grounded. Wagner's operas, particularly the ones Nietzsche heard performed, Tristan und Isolde, Die Meistersinger, seemed to embody the fusion of Apollonian form and Dionysian passion that would become central to Nietzsche's own thinking. His academic career, meanwhile, was progressing remarkably well. He published scholarly articles on ancient Greek texts that demonstrated both technical mastery and original insight. His professor Ritschl recommended him for a position at the University of Basel in Switzerland, a position in classical philology. This was extraordinary. Nietzsche was only 24 years old, and he had not yet completed his doctorate. But on the strength of his published work, the University of Basel offered him a professorship. Leipzig granted him a doctorate without requiring a dissertation, based on his published articles. He was, at 24, Professor Nietzsche, the youngest person ever appointed to such a position at Basel. It was a triumph, evidence of his brilliance, and it also meant financial security, a regular salary, and the prestige of an academic appointment. He took up the position in the spring of 1869, moving to Basel, a beautiful city on the Rhine, surrounded by mountains, cultured and prosperous. His duties included teaching classical philology, giving lectures on Greek and Latin authors, supervising students. He was not a natural teacher in the sense of being warm or engaging with students on a personal level, but his lectures were serious and substantive, and he approached the work with the same intensity he brought to everything. And Basel had the advantage of being close to Tribschen, where Wagner lived, so Nietzsche could continue his visits, immersing himself in Wagner's world, in the music and the conversation and the sense of participating in something culturally significant. But then came the Franco-Prussian War. In 1870, France and Prussia went to war, a conflict driven by nationalist ambitions and dynastic politics, and Prussia won decisively. The war led to the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership, the creation of the German Empire with the Prussian king as Kaiser. It was a moment of nationalist triumph, celebrated throughout Germany. Nietzsche, as a Prussian citizen, felt obligated to contribute. He volunteered as a medical orderly, serving in the ambulance corps, tending to wounded soldiers near the front. It was brief service, only a few weeks, but it was enough to contract dysentery and diphtheria, serious illnesses that nearly killed him. He was sent back to Germany to recover, and he did recover, but he was never the same physically. The diseases left him weakened, and they may have aggravated whatever underlying condition was already compromising his health. From this point forward, his life would be a constant struggle with illness. Severe headaches that could incapacitate him for days, problems so severe he sometimes had to dictate his writing because he couldn't see to write himself, digestive troubles that restricted his diet, insomnia, and a general fragility that required careful management. He returned to Basel and resumed his teaching, but the illness had marked a turning point. He began to think of himself as someone living on borrowed time, someone who needed to accomplish his real work quickly before the body gave out completely. And the real work was not philology, not the technical analysis of ancient texts, but philosophy, the development of the ideas that had been forming through his reading of Schopenhauer and his friendship with Wagner. In 1872 he published his first book, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. It was unlike anything else in classical philology. It was, in fact, not really philology at all, but philosophy and cultural criticism using ancient Greece as subject and springboard. The argument of The Birth of Tragedy was radical. Nietzsche claimed that Greek culture, particularly Greek tragedy, arose from the tension between two fundamental forces he named after Greek gods, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian was the force of order, clarity, individuation, the principle of form and reason, associated with the visual arts and with sculpture. The Dionysian was the force of chaos, intoxication, dissolution of individual boundaries, the principle of ecstatic unity with nature, associated with music and with the frenzied worship of Dionysus. Greek tragedy, Nietzsche argued, emerged when these two forces were held in creative tension. The Dionysian energy of the chorus, the music, the ecstatic identification with suffering, combined with the Apollonian structure of the dramatic form, the individual characters, the poetic language. This combination produced art of unparalleled power, art that faced the horror of existence, suffering, death, meaninglessness, and transformed it into beauty. But then, Nietzsche argued, Greek tragedy was killed by the rise of rationalism, specifically by Socrates and the philosophical tradition he initiated. Socrates represented the dominance of reason, the belief that everything can be understood, that knowledge leads to virtue, that the world is fundamentally rational and just. This was, for Nietzsche, a lie, a comfortable lie but a lie nonetheless. Socrates couldn't face the Dionysian truth of chaos and suffering, so he invented a world of rational order. And this Socratic turn killed tragedy, because tragedy depends on acknowledging what cannot be rationalized. The influence of Socrates led to Plato, to Christianity, to the entire Western tradition of rationalism and optimism, and this tradition was, in Nietzsche's view, a long decline from the heights of Greek tragedy. The book was also a celebration of Richard Wagner, whom Nietzsche saw as reviving the Dionysian spirit in modern Germany, as creating music drama that could restore what had been lost. The final sections of the book praised Wagner as the hope for cultural rebirth. This was not objective scholarship. This was passionate advocacy, philosophy in the guise of classical philology, and the professional philologists were horrified. The response from the academic community was almost uniformly negative. Nietzsche's former professor Ritschl, who had championed him, was disappointed. Other scholars attacked the book for its lack of scholarly rigor, its speculative leaps, its mixing of philosophy and philology. Nietzsche's reputation in academic circles was damaged, and it never fully recovered. Students stopped enrolling in his courses. He was increasingly isolated within the university. But the book also attracted a different kind of attention. Some readers, particularly younger intellectuals interested in Wagner and in cultural renewal, found it thrilling. Here was someone willing to challenge the entire rationalist tradition, to say that Socrates and Plato and the whole edifice of Western philosophy had been a wrong turn. Here was someone taking seriously the darker, irrational forces of existence and arguing they needed to be reintegrated into culture. The book was controversial, which meant it was read and discussed, even if mostly criticized. Nietzsche had announced himself as a thinker, not just a scholar. His relationship with Wagner, though, was beginning to show strains, though Nietzsche was slow to acknowledge them. He continued visiting Tribschen, continued attending performances of Wagner's operas, continued defending Wagner in print. But there were troubling signs. Wagner's nationalism was becoming more pronounced, his identification with the new German Empire more enthusiastic. His anti-Semitism, always present, was becoming more overt. And he was working on Parsifal, an opera that would turn out to be deeply Christian in its themes, a celebration of redemption through suffering and renunciation, exactly the kind of ascetic ideal that Nietzsche was beginning to see as life-denying. The final break came in 1878, though it was gradual rather than sudden. Nietzsche simply stopped visiting, stopped writing to Wagner, withdrew from the circle. Wagner was hurt and angry. Cosima Wagner, Richard's wife, was bitterly resentful, seeing Nietzsche's withdrawal as betrayal. But for Nietzsche it was necessary. He had outgrown Wagner, or perhaps he had finally seen clearly what Wagner represented. not the Dionysian affirmation of life but a retreat into Christian pessimism, a glorification of suffering for its own sake, a fundamentally reactive and resentful worldview dressed up in mythological grandeur. And his health was deteriorating further. By 1879, the headaches and eye problems were so severe that he could barely function. He took a leave of absence from the university, hoping that rest would help. It didn't. He resigned his position at Basel, ending his academic career. He was given a modest pension, enough to live on if he lived simply, and he became, for the rest of his productive life, a wanderer, moving from place to place in search of climates that might ease his suffering, writing when he could, alone most of the time, disconnected from the academic and cultural institutions that had once seemed to be his natural home. The next period of Nietzsche's life, from his resignation in 1879 until his collapse in 1889, was the decade of his mature philosophy, the period when he wrote the books that would eventually make him famous, though during these years almost no one read them. He lived in boarding houses and cheap hotels, moving between the Swiss Alps in summer and the Mediterranean coast in winter, chasing health that always eluded him. He had to follow strict routines to manage his condition: specific foods, regular walks, darkness for his eyes, limited working hours. He was often in pain. He was almost always alone. He had a few friends he corresponded with, but face-to-face contact was rare. And yet, out of this isolation and suffering came some of the most powerful philosophy written in the 19th century. His first book after leaving Basel was Human, All Too Human, published in 1878 while he was still technically employed but already withdrawing from academic life. It was dedicated to Voltaire, the French Enlightenment philosopher, a deliberate signal that Nietzsche was moving away from the romantic Wagnerian framework of the birth of tragedy toward something more critical and skeptical. The book was a collection of aphorisms, short observations and arguments on a wide range of topics: morality, religion, art, psychology, science. The style was new for Nietzsche, terse and direct, each aphorism a compact unit of thought. And the content marked a shift. He was now attacking metaphysics, the idea that there's some reality beyond the physical world, some transcendent truth accessible to reason or intuition. He was attacking romantic ideas of genius and art. He was, in effect, turning his critical method on the things he had once celebrated, including his own earlier work. The central target was Christianity, though he approached it obliquely. He analyzed Christian morality not as divine command but as psychological phenomenon, as the product of particular historical and social conditions. He argued that what Christianity calls virtues, humility, pity, self-denial, are actually expressions of weakness, of a life-denying attitude that fears strength and health. This was the beginning of what would become his sustained critique of Christian morality, the project of showing that what presents itself as absolute and God-given is actually contingent and human, rooted in psychology rather than theology. And it was liberating for him, this turn toward psychological analysis, because it provided a method for understanding values without accepting them, for explaining why people believe what they believe without having to argue directly about whether those beliefs are true. Daybreak, published in 1881, continued this project. The subtitle was Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality, and the book systematically attacked the foundations of conventional morality. Nietzsche argued that morality is not given by God or by reason but is constructed by human beings for particular purposes, usually to protect the weak against the strong. He introduced the idea that much of what passes for moral behavior is actually driven by hidden motives: fear, resentment, the desire for revenge against those who are stronger or happier. He was developing the method that would later be called genealogy, tracing moral concepts back to their historical origins to show that they're not eternal truths but products of specific conditions and interests. And he was living, during these years, a strange, ascetic existence. He would rent a room in some small town in the Swiss mountains. Sils Maria became his regular summer location, and he would walk, write, eat simple meals, go to bed early. Or he would move to the Mediterranean, Nice, Genoa, Rapallo, and follow the same routine in warmer climate. The places were beautiful. The mountains around Sils Maria were stunning, the lake reflecting the peaks, the air clear and cold. The Mediterranean coast offered different beauty, the blue water, the light, the scent of vegetation. But he experienced these places mostly alone, walking the same paths day after day, sitting in his rented room writing by hand in notebooks, his eyes inches from the page because his vision was so poor, stopping when the pain became too much. The discipline this required was extraordinary. Most people in such physical distress would have given up, would have sought comfort, distraction, social contact. Nietzsche kept working because the work was what mattered, because the ideas had to be expressed, because there was something in him that refused to submit to the body's limitations. In August of 1881, during one of his walks near Sils Maria, he had what he described as a vision or revelation. He was walking beside the lake, near a large pyramidal rock, when the idea of eternal recurrence struck him with overwhelming force. The idea was this: if time is infinite, stretching forward and backward without end, but the number of possible states of the universe is finite, then eventually every possible configuration must repeat. And if it repeats once, it must repeat infinitely many times. Which means that this life, this exact life with all its moments of joy and suffering, has occurred before and will occur again infinitely. Every detail exactly the same, an eternal return of the identical. The question this raises is, can you bear this? Can you love your life enough that you would will its eternal repetition, every moment of it, the pain as well as the pleasure, the failures as well as the successes? This became for Nietzsche a kind of test, a thought experiment that reveals whether one truly affirms life or secretly wishes it were otherwise. The idea obsessed him. He began writing what would become his most famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book unlike anything in the philosophical tradition. It was written in a poetic, prophetic style, deliberately echoing the Bible and the Zoroastrian scriptures, but inverting their message. The book tells the story of Zarathustra, a figure based on the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster, who descends from his mountain solitude to teach humanity. But what he teaches is not a new religion or a new morality but the death of God and the need for humanity to overcome itself. The book was written in 4 parts between 1883 and 1885, each part composed in intense bursts of creative energy during his wanderings. Thus Spoke Zarathustra contains Nietzsche's most important ideas, though presented in literary rather than systematic form. The opening scene has Zarathustra descending from his mountain after 10 years of solitude, encountering a saint in the forest who is still praising God, and realizing that the saint hasn't heard the news: God is dead. This declaration, God is dead, is often misunderstood. Nietzsche didn't mean it as a simple statement of atheism, as if he were just saying, I don't believe in God. He meant it as a cultural diagnosis. The idea of God, the Christian God who gives meaning and value and moral order to the universe, no longer functions for modern Europeans. Science has undermined the literal truth of biblical claims. Historical scholarship has shown the Bible to be a human document. Philosophy has provided alternative frameworks for understanding reality. The cultural authority of Christianity has been eroded, though many people haven't yet fully realized it. They continue going through the motions, attending church, professing belief, but the belief is hollow. God is dead and we have killed him through our pursuit of truth, through our refusal to accept comfortable falsehoods. But if God is dead, if there's no transcendent source of meaning and value, what follows? Nietzsche's answer is terrifying and exhilarating at once. It means we are free to create new values, but it also means we have lost the security of absolute foundations. The death of God is a crisis, perhaps the greatest crisis in human history, because it removes the structure that has organized Western civilization for 2 millennia. Zarathustra's response to this crisis is to teach the Übermensch, usually translated as Overman or Superman, though both translations are problematic. The Übermensch is not a biological superior or a member of a master race. This is how the Nazis would later distort the concept, but it's a complete betrayal of what Nietzsche meant. The Übermensch is someone who has overcome the nihilism that follows from God's death by creating their own values, by affirming life even in its suffering and meaninglessness, by becoming what they are rather than conforming to external standards. It's an ethical ideal, not a biological or political one. Humanity as it currently exists is something to be overcome, not through genetic manipulation or conquest but through self-transformation, through the difficult work of becoming creators rather than followers. Another central idea in Zarathustra is the will to power, though Nietzsche would develop this more fully in later works. The will to power is not simply the desire to dominate others, though it can take that form. It's the fundamental drive of all living things to grow, to expand, to overcome resistance, to impose form on chaos. Every organism seeks not just survival but enhancement, not just maintaining itself but increasing its power. This applies to individuals, to cultures, to ideas. And it applies in the moral realm. Moral systems are expressions of will to power, attempts by particular groups to impose their values on others. Christianity, for instance, is the will to power of the weak, who have made their weakness into a virtue and condemned strength as evil. Understanding this doesn't mean rejecting all morality but recognizing that all values are created, that there are no value-free perspectives, that every evaluation is an expression of some form of life seeking to enhance itself. The book also preaches eternal recurrence, asking the reader to imagine that every moment will return infinitely and to live in such a way that they could will this return. And it speaks of love of fate, amor fati, the attitude of not merely accepting what happens but loving it, affirming it, seeing even suffering as necessary and valuable. These ideas are presented not as arguments but as proclamations, as poetry, as challenges. The style is meant to provoke and inspire rather than convince through logic. And the book was a complete commercial failure. Nietzsche had it printed at his own expense. Almost no one bought it. Almost no one reviewed it. He sent copies to friends and acquaintances, and they were mostly baffled or disturbed. The prophet spoke to an empty room. He continued writing. Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, returned to a more conventional philosophical style, though still aphoristic rather than systematic. The book's subtitle was Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, signaling that this was preliminary work toward something larger. The central argument was an attack on the entire Western philosophical tradition for its dogmatism, its belief in absolute truths, its inability to recognize that all thinking is perspectival, shaped by the thinker's values and interests. Philosophers claim to pursue truth objectively, but actually they're constructing systems that reflect and justify their own prejudices. Plato's theory of forms is not a discovery but an invention, a way of denying the messy, changing world of bodies and elevating an imaginary world of pure ideas. Kant's categorical imperative is not rational but reflects Christian morality in philosophical disguise. Every philosopher is essentially autobiographical, writing their own values into supposedly universal principles. Nietzsche proposed instead a perspectivism. All knowledge is from a particular perspective, and there is no view from nowhere, no God's eye view of objective truth. This doesn't mean all perspectives are equally valid. Some are more powerful, more life-enhancing, more truthful in the sense of corresponding to reality as experienced. But it does mean giving up the quest for absolute certainty, for foundations that cannot be questioned. And it means recognizing that interpretation is all there is. There are no facts, only interpretations. This is often taken as a radical relativism, but it's more subtle than that. Nietzsche is arguing that our access to reality is always mediated by perspective, that we can't strip away all perspective to reach some pure, uninterpreted reality. But some perspectives are better than others, better in the sense of being more honest, more comprehensive, more conducive to life. The book also developed his distinction between master and slave morality. Master morality, he argued, is the morality of the strong who define good as what they themselves embody: strength, beauty, courage, nobility. Bad, for them, is simply the opposite: weakness, ugliness, cowardice. It's a morality of affirmation based on a yes to oneself. Slave morality, by contrast, is the morality of the weak who cannot affirm themselves directly because they lack power. So they invent a different framework. They call the strong evil, and themselves good, precisely because they are weak. Humility becomes a virtue, pride a sin. Suffering becomes redemptive, pleasure suspect. It's a morality of ressentiment, rooted in a no to the other, to the strong, and only derivatively a yes to themselves. Christianity, Nietzsche argued, is slave morality par excellence, a system invented by the powerless to condemn those with power. This analysis was developed further in On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, which Nietzsche later said was his most important book. It consists of 3 essays tracing the origins of moral concepts through historical and psychological analysis. The first essay, Good and Evil, Good and Bad, tells the story of how the original aristocratic values, good as strong, noble, beautiful, were inverted by the priestly class, particularly the Jews who had been enslaved and oppressed and who responded by revaluing everything. Now the powerful are evil and the powerless are good. This slave revolt in morality succeeded through Christianity, spreading across Europe and eventually becoming the dominant moral framework. The second essay, Guilt, Bad Conscience and Related Matters, analyzes how internalized aggression creates conscience. When human beings were confined in society, their aggressive instincts could no longer be directed outward, so they turned inward, creating guilt, self-punishment, the whole apparatus of conscience. The third essay, What Do Ascetic Ideals Mean?, examines the ascetic ideal, the denial of the body, the elevation of spirit over flesh, the hatred of life itself, and shows how it pervades not just religion but also philosophy and even science, which Nietzsche argues is often motivated by a will to truth that hates appearance and change. These books, Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, Genealogy, represent the core of Nietzsche's mature philosophy, the sustained attack on Christianity and on the entire tradition of Western metaphysics and morality, combined with the attempt to sketch an alternative based on life affirmation, will to power, and the creation of new values. And they were written in extraordinary circumstances: chronic pain, near total isolation, poverty, failure to find an audience. He was writing for a future he believed would eventually understand him, addressing readers who didn't yet exist. The discipline required to continue under these conditions reveals something about the man. He could have stopped. He could have given up, accepted his situation, found some easier way to live. But the work mattered more than comfort, more than recognition, more perhaps than health itself. In 1888, the final year before his collapse, he entered a period of extraordinary productivity. He wrote The Case of Wagner, a bitter attack on his former idol, accusing Wagner of decadence, of life denial disguised as art, of pandering to mass taste, of being fundamentally un-Dionysian despite all the mythological trappings. He wrote Twilight of the Idols, subtitled How to Philosophize with a Hammer, a brief, aggressive book that recapitulated his main arguments and attacked various philosophical idols: Socrates, Plato, Christianity, German philosophy. He wrote The Antichrist, a full-scale assault on Christianity, calling it the religion of the weak and sick, arguing that it represents a hatred of life, that its concept of pity is a vice that preserves what should perish, that its promise of another world devalues this one. The book ends by calling Christianity the single greatest corruption in human history, a poisoning of Western civilization at its source. And he wrote Ecce Homo, the strange autobiography he was revising when he collapsed. The book is organized around chapters like Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books, and it includes discussions of each of his published works. It reads in places like Megalomania, Nietzsche calling himself the greatest philosopher, predicting that his work will split history in two, describing his psychological insights as unmatched. But it's also, at times, genuinely insightful, explaining his methods, his influences, his intentions. And it reflects a man who knew, at some level, that he had done something significant, even if the world hadn't yet noticed, a man who was perhaps trying to justify his life to himself, to affirm that the suffering had been worth it because of what he had created. The tone is manic, the self-assessment grandiose, but given what we know now about his influence, some of the grandiosity was actually accurate prediction. These final months in Turin before the collapse seemed to have been almost happy, or at least less painful than usual. The climate agreed with him. He walked the arcaded streets, rode in the mornings, ate his simple meals, felt productive. He wrote letters to friends describing Turin as a revelation, the first place where he felt truly at home. There's a photograph of him from this period, though whether taken in Turin or shortly before isn't certain. He looks gaunt, his mustache enormous, his eyes intense but also somehow distant. He looks like a man who has pushed himself to extremes, who has used himself up in service of his work. And then came January the 3rd, the horse, the collapse, the silence. After he was taken back to Germany and placed in the Jena clinic, his mother eventually brought him to Naumburg, the town where he had grown up. She cared for him in the house where he had lived as a child after his father's death, the household of pious women now including one more invalid. He was docile, mostly silent. He would sit for hours without speaking. Sometimes he played simple melodies on the piano, the instrument he had loved since childhood. Sometimes he would speak in fragments, sentences that didn't connect to anything, words that seemed to come from some broken interior. But mostly he was simply there, a body continuing its routines without the animating intelligence. His mother cared for him until her death in 1897, and then his sister Elizabeth took over. Elizabeth had been living in Paraguay with her husband, Bernhard Forster, attempting to found a pure Germanic colony called Nueva Germania, a project driven by anti-Semitic ideology and utopian delusion. It failed, and Forster committed suicide in 1889. Elizabeth returned to Germany and took control of her brother's literary estate. She moved him to Weimar, where she established the Nietzsche archive, and she set about shaping his legacy. She edited his unpublished writings, selecting and arranging them to support her own nationalist and anti-Semitic views. She compiled a book called The Will to Power from his notebooks, presenting it as his systematic philosophy, though he had never organized it that way. She welcomed nationalist and eventually Nazi intellectuals to the archive, encouraged their interpretation of Nietzsche as prophet of German supremacy. And she controlled access to her brother, displaying him to visitors like a relic, the silent philosopher in his chair, unaware of what was being done in his name. Nietzsche died on August 25, 1900 in Weimar. The immediate cause was pneumonia following a stroke, but he had been dying for 11 years, his body outlasting his mind. He was buried in the churchyard in Raaken, next to his father, the pastor whose faith the son had spent his life dismantling. The funeral was Christian, with hymns and prayers, the final irony for a man who had declared God dead and Christianity a corruption. But he was beyond caring, beyond knowing. The body was returned to the earth. The work remained. And the work began slowly to find readers. In the 1890s, while Nietzsche sat silent in his mother's house and then in his sister's archive, his books began to be discovered by younger intellectuals in Germany and across Europe. They were shocking, disturbing, exhilarating. Here was a philosopher who wrote with passion and style, who attacked everything sacred, who offered not comfort but challenge. The influence spread. Artists, writers, psychologists, political theorists read Nietzsche and found tools for understanding modernity, for critiquing conventional morality, for thinking about power and culture and the individual. But the interpretation was contested from the beginning. Some readers emphasized his individualism, his attacks on herd mentality, his celebration of the exceptional person. Others emphasized his cultural criticism, his diagnosis of European decadence, his call for revaluation of values. And Elizabeth's distortions added a nationalist and racial element that was never really there in Nietzsche's own writings. When the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, they claimed Nietzsche as a precursor. Elizabeth, who lived until 1935, welcomed their attention. Hitler visited the archive. Nazi ideologists cited Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch as justification for their racial ideology, his will to power as endorsement of military aggression, his critique of democracy as support for authoritarianism. This was a grotesque distortion. Nietzsche despised anti-Semitism, calling it a sign of weakness and ressentiment. He despised German nationalism, considering it provincial and culturally destructive. He despised the herd mentality of mass movements, which Nazism exemplified. His Übermensch was an individual achievement of self-overcoming, not a racial category. His will to power was a metaphysical principle, not a political program. But the Nazis didn't care about accuracy. They took what they wanted and ignored the rest. After World War II, when the full horror of Nazism was revealed, Nietzsche's reputation was tainted by association. For a time, he was seen as somehow responsible for the catastrophe, as if his philosophy had led inevitably to the death camps. But this didn't hold up to serious examination. Scholars, particularly Walter Kaufmann in the United States, worked to recover the actual Nietzsche from the Nazi distortions, producing accurate translations and careful interpretations that showed how far the Nazis had strayed from the text. And the post-war period saw a revival of serious philosophical engagement with Nietzsche's ideas. The existentialists, Sartre, Camus, Heidegger, grappled with his analysis of nihilism, the problem of meaning in a godless universe, the necessity of creating values rather than discovering them. Foucault and other postmodern thinkers took up his genealogical method, his perspectivism, his emphasis on power relations in the production of knowledge. Nietzsche became, along with Marx and Freud, one of the great masters of suspicion, thinkers who taught us to look beneath surface claims to hidden motives and power dynamics. The death of God, which Nietzsche announced, has become a widely accepted cultural fact, at least in Western Europe and among educated classes generally. The majority of people in many European countries now identify as secular or non-religious. The authority of Christian churches has declined dramatically. The moral framework that Christianity provided has been largely replaced by various forms of humanism, utilitarianism, rights-based ethics, all of which try to ground morality without reference to God. This is exactly the situation Nietzsche predicted and warned about. He didn't celebrate the death of God so much as recognize it as accomplished fact and warn that the consequences would be severe. Without God, without transcendent foundations for morality and meaning, what prevents nihilism, the sense that nothing matters? Nietzsche thought most people would not be able to bear this, would retreat into various forms of comforting illusion. And he thought the task of philosophy was to face the void honestly and create meaning anyway, not by denying the death of God but by affirming life without God. The Übermensch remains a contested ideal. Is it possible for human beings to create their own values, to overcome themselves, to affirm life fully despite suffering and meaninglessness? Or is this an impossible standard that leads to despair when it cannot be met? Different readers have answered differently. Some see Nietzsche as offering a path beyond nihilism, a way to live authentically in modernity. Others see his philosophy as leading inevitably to nihilism itself, because if all values are created, if there's no foundation beyond human will, then all values are equally arbitrary, equally meaningless. Nietzsche was aware of this problem. He distinguished between active and passive nihilism. Passive nihilism is the giving up, the sense that because there are no absolute values, nothing matters. Active nihilism is the recognition that values are created, that we are responsible for them, and the embracing of this responsibility. The Übermensch would be someone capable of active nihilism, of creating values knowing they are created, of affirming life knowing there's no cosmic justification for it. The will to power has been perhaps the most influential and most controversial of Nietzsche's ideas. He meant it as a descriptive claim about reality, not a moral prescription. Everything that lives seeks to enhance its power, to grow, to overcome resistance. This is not good or bad, it simply is. Recognizing this allows us to understand phenomena that otherwise seem puzzling. Why do people seek not just happiness but achievement? Because achievement is an expression of will to power. Why do moral systems compete for dominance? Because they are expressions of different forms of life seeking to impose their values. Why is life characterized by struggle and conflict rather than harmony? Because the will to power of different organisms and groups inevitably brings them into competition. The concept has been used in psychology, where the drive for mastery and competence is recognized as fundamental. It's been used in political theory, in analyses of how power operates in social relations. It's been used in biology and ecology, where the competitive dynamics of life are studied. And it's been used to justify domination and cruelty on the grounds that might makes right. Nietzsche would have rejected this abuse. The will to power is descriptive, not prescriptive. Recognizing it doesn't mean celebrating every expression of it. His critique of morality, his genealogical method of tracing concepts back to their origins to show they are human constructions rather than divine commands, has become standard in many fields. We now routinely analyze moral claims by asking whose interests they serve, what power relations they reinforce, how they arose historically. We're suspicious of claims to objectivity, alert to hidden biases and perspectives. This is Nietzsche's influence, his method of suspicion, his insistence that we look beneath the surface of values to their psychological and social roots. And his emphasis on perspectivism, the idea that all knowledge is from a particular viewpoint, has influenced epistemology, hermeneutics, postmodern thought generally. There is no view from nowhere. All interpretation is perspectival. This doesn't mean all perspectives are equal, but it does mean giving up the quest for absolute, perspective-free truth. But there are dangers in Nietzsche's thought, dangers he was aware of but couldn't fully resolve. If all values are created, if there's no transcendent foundation, what prevents the strong from simply dominating the weak? Nietzsche's answer would be that nothing prevents it, that this is how life works, but that the truly strong don't need to dominate because they affirm themselves without reference to others, while domination is actually a sign of ressentiment, of needing to put others down to feel superior. But this is a subtle distinction easily lost. And his attacks on pity, on compassion for suffering, on democratic equality, can sound harsh, even cruel. He believed that protecting the weak from natural selection weakens the species, that modern medicine and welfare states preserve those who should perish, that equality is a lie that brings everyone down to mediocrity. These ideas are deeply troubling, especially in light of 20th century history, when similar arguments were used to justify eugenics and worse. Nietzsche was not advocating such programs, he would have despised their collectivism and coercion. But his rhetoric can be read that way and has been. Perhaps the central question Nietzsche's life and work pose is whether it's possible to live his philosophy. Can a human being actually overcome themselves, create values, affirm eternal recurrence, say yes to life in all its suffering? Nietzsche tried. He lived with extraordinary discipline despite crippling illness. He continued working despite having no audience. He faced his ideas honestly even when they led to terrible loneliness. But he also collapsed at 44, spent the last 11 years of his life in silence, and left us with the image of that breakdown in Turin, throwing his arms around a beaten horse as if trying to protect it or comfort it, or perhaps share in its suffering. This moment of overwhelming compassion, of identification with animal suffering, seems to contradict the harsh individualism of his philosophy. Or perhaps it reveals something deeper, that beneath the attacks on pity was a man capable of profound empathy, that the philosophy was armor against a sensitivity that might otherwise have been unbearable. The ideas live on, endlessly reinterpreted, endlessly controversial, endlessly relevant. We still live in the world Nietzsche diagnosed, the world after God's death, the world without foundations, the world where values are contested and meaning must be created rather than discovered. We still face the questions he posed. What does it mean to live authentically? How do we create meaning without transcendent guarantees? What are the sources of our values, and can we affirm them once we recognize their human origins? Can we say yes to life despite suffering? These remain our questions because we remain in the situation he described. Modernity is the death of God writ large, the dissolution of traditional structures of meaning, the terrifying freedom to create ourselves. Nietzsche saw this coming, or perhaps saw that it had already arrived and people hadn't noticed. And he tried to show a way through, not back to old certainties but forward to new creation. In Sils Maria, the village in the Swiss Alps where Nietzsche spent many summers, there is a rock by the lake where he reportedly had his vision of eternal recurrence. It's still there, unchanged, and tourists visit it and locals know the story. The lake reflects the mountains as it always has. The seasons cycle as they always have. The world continues, indifferent to the man who walked here and thought thoughts that would help reshape it. But the thoughts remain, passed from reader to reader, argued over, applied, rejected, reconsidered. This is how ideas outlive their creators, how a man who spent most of his adult life in isolation and illness can speak to millions who never knew him, how a collapse in Turin in January 1889 becomes not an ending but a pause in a conversation that continues. If you've stayed with this exploration to the end, if you've followed this trajectory from the collapse backward through the life and forward through the ideas, I hope it's given you something to think about, some way of seeing Nietzsche not as a collection of slogans, God is dead, Übermensch, will to power, but as a human being who thought with extraordinary courage and paid a terrible price for it. If this kind of deep engagement with history and ideas resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the like button helps as well. These stories matter. These lives and the ideas they produced continue to shape how we understand ourselves and our world. The work of thinking through them, of trying to understand what they mean and whether they're true, is work that never ends. The silence that descended on Friedrich Nietzsche after January 1889 was absolute in its own way, but it was also, paradoxically, the beginning of his voice becoming heard. While he sat in clinics and then in his mother's house, while his mind wandered territories no one could map or follow, his books began their slow journey from obscurity to influence. The contrast is almost unbearable to contemplate. The man himself reduced to a shell, sometimes playing piano, sometimes speaking fragments that connected to nothing, mostly just present in body while absent in every way that mattered, and simultaneously, the ideas he had fought to express beginning finally to find the readers he had written for, the audience he had imagined existing somewhere in the future. The Jena Asylum where he was first taken after Basel was a respected institution, and the doctors there tried to understand what had happened to him. They conducted examinations, recorded symptoms, proposed diagnoses. The records from this period describe a patient who was sometimes agitated, sometimes calm, who would speak coherently for brief moments and then lapse into confusion. He recognized some visitors, failed to recognize others. He would make grandiose claims about his identity, that he was a great man, that he had accomplished important work, which the doctors interpreted as delusions of grandeur, though in fact these claims were largely accurate. The diagnosis they settled on was progressive paralysis, which in the medical terminology of the time usually meant tertiary syphilis, the final stage where the spirochete bacteria invades the brain and nervous system, causing dementia, paralysis, and eventually death. Whether Nietzsche actually had syphilis remains uncertain. He may have contracted it as a young man. There are references in his letters to visiting prostitutes, and syphilis was common among young men in university towns in the 1860s. Or he may not have. The symptoms of tertiary syphilis overlap with other neurological conditions, and the diagnostic methods of the 1880s were not reliable. Some modern scholars have proposed alternative diagnoses: a slow-growing brain tumor, inherited mental illness, even a rare metabolic disorder. Without autopsy records, and none seem to have survived or perhaps none were performed, we cannot know for certain. What we know is that his mind deteriorated in a pattern consistent with organic brain disease, that the deterioration was progressive and irreversible, and that whatever the specific cause, the brilliant consciousness that had produced Zarathustra and the genealogy was extinguished. After about a year at Jena, the doctors concluded there was nothing more they could do. He was not violent, not dangerous to himself or others, but he required constant supervision and care. His mother, Franziska, now in her 60s, made the decision to bring him home to Naumburg. She was a devout woman, the same woman who had raised her children in strict Lutheran piety, the woman whose faith her son had spent his adult life attacking. But she was also a mother, and she took her broken son into her house and cared for him with the practical devotion that seems to have characterized her approach to life. She fed him, dressed him, walked with him through the streets of Naumburg when the weather allowed, kept him clean and comfortable. He was docile in her care, making no trouble, requiring only the simple routines of feeding and hygiene and exercise. The house in Naumburg where this took place was the same house the family had moved to after his father's death, the house where Friedrich had grown up, where he had first studied Greek and Latin, where he had practiced piano and written devotional poetry as a child. Now he was back, but transformed, or rather untransformed, returned to a state of dependence like childhood but without childhood's potential, without the future opening ahead. The rooms must have been familiar to him in some dim way, but whether he recognized them, whether he remembered anything of his earlier life there, we cannot know. He did not speak of the past. His utterances, when he spoke at all, were disconnected from context, brief phrases that might have meant something to him but conveyed nothing to those caring for him. Sometimes visitors came, old friends curious or concerned, wanting to see what had become of him. They left disturbed. The contrast between the fierce intelligence they remembered and the vacant presence before them was too stark. Some wrote about these visits, describing how Nietzsche would sit quietly, would sometimes seem to recognize them, would speak a few words that seemed almost coherent before trailing off into silence. Other times he would not acknowledge the visitor at all, would simply continue whatever he was doing. Sitting, standing at the window, playing simple melodies on the piano with one finger. The piano playing was perhaps the most poignant detail. Music had been one of his great loves, a refuge throughout his life, and even with his mind destroyed, his fingers remembered how to find notes, how to construct simple melodies. But the complex compositions he had written in his youth, the romantic pieces that showed real talent, those were gone. Only fragments remained, children's songs, simple tunes repeated endlessly. His sister Elizabeth returned from Paraguay in 1893, several years after her husband's suicide. She had been living in the failed colony of Nueva Germania, trying to hold together the remnant of settlers who remained after Bernhard Forster's death, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of their anti-Semitic utopian experiment. But the project was hopeless, and she came back to Germany with no money, no prospects, and a need to rebuild her life. She visited Naumburg and saw her brother's condition, and she also saw an opportunity. Friedrich had written books that were beginning to attract attention. He had notebooks filled with unpublished material. He had a growing reputation as a radical philosopher. And he had no capacity to control what was done with his work. Elizabeth was ambitious, energetic, and untroubled by scruples about accuracy or her brother's actual intentions. She decided to take control of his literary legacy. At first, while their mother was still alive and in charge, Elizabeth could only assist and begin to familiarize herself with the materials. But when Franziska died in April 1897, Elizabeth became Friedrich's legal guardian and sole heir. She moved him from Naumburg to Weimar, the cultural heart of Germany, the city associated with Goethe and Schiller, and she established the Nietzsche archive there. The archive was ostensibly a research center devoted to preserving and publishing her brother's works, but it was also a kind of shrine, with Friedrich himself as the silent centerpiece. She would bring visitors to see him, displaying him like a relic of greatness. Photographs from this period show him in a chair, wrapped in blankets, his mustache now entirely white, his face gaunt, his eyes staring at nothing. Elizabeth would stand beside him, the devoted sister, protector of genius, interpreter of his legacy. The interpretation she offered was deeply distorted. Elizabeth was a German nationalist who believed in racial purity and German cultural superiority. She had married an anti-Semitic agitator and followed him to South America to found an Aryan colony. These were precisely the attitudes her brother had despised. Nietzsche had written scathingly about nationalism, had called anti-Semitism a sign of weakness and ressentiment, had praised Jewish culture and condemned the anti-Semitic movement in Germany. But Elizabeth ignored all this. She began editing his unpublished notebooks, selecting passages that could be read as supporting her own views and suppressing or downplaying passages that contradicted them. She compiled a book called The Will to Power, presenting it as Nietzsche's magnum opus, his systematic philosophy that he had been working toward throughout his career. In reality, the notebooks she drew from were working notes, fragmentary thoughts, experimental ideas, many of which Nietzsche had rejected or superseded in his published works. But Elizabeth arranged them to tell a story she wanted told, the story of Nietzsche as prophet of German greatness and will to power as a metaphysical principle justifying domination. The archive became a gathering place for nationalist intellectuals, and later, as the Nazi movement rose in Germany, for Nazi sympathizers and eventually Nazi officials themselves. Elizabeth cultivated these connections. She welcomed their attention, accepted their honors, allowed them to claim her brother as a precursor to their movement. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, She sent him congratulatory telegrams. He visited the archive in 1934, and photographs show Elizabeth, now in her 80s, presenting Hitler with her brother's walking stick, a symbolic passing of the torch from philosopher to Führer. It was a grotesque betrayal of everything Nietzsche had stood for, but Elizabeth either did not understand this or did not care. She died in November 1935, having lived long enough to see the Nazis firmly in power and having done her best to tie her brother's name to their cause. But during all these years, during the 1890s when Elizabeth was beginning her editorial work, during the early 1900s when the Nietzsche archive was becoming established, during the 1910s and 20s when his philosophy was being debated and distorted, Friedrich himself was simply there, alive but absent, his body continuing its biological functions while consciousness had fled. He sat in rooms in Weimar. He was taken for walks in good weather. He was fed regular meals. He slept and woke in cycles. He was given medical care when he showed signs of illness. And he had no apparent awareness of any of it, no sense of himself, no memory of who he had been, no understanding of the controversy his work was generating or the way his name was being used. There is something deeply disturbing about this fate, perhaps more disturbing than a quick death would have been. If he had died in Turin, collapsed in the street and died within days, there would have been tragedy but also a kind of completeness. The man who lived by his mind would have ended when his mind ended. But instead, the body persisted, a living contradiction of everything he had taught about the importance of dying at the right time, about not clinging to life beyond one's capacity to live well. He had written in Zarathustra about the importance of a timely death, about how most people die too late, become burdens, lose their dignity. And here he was, living exactly that kind of too-late life, the mind that had insisted on truth reduced to a babbling shell, the body that had always been weak outlasting the consciousness that had given it purpose. The final illness came in August 1900. He suffered a series of strokes and then pneumonia developed. In the medicine of the time, pneumonia was often fatal, especially in someone already weakened. The doctors attended him but there was little they could do. On August 25, 1900 he died. He was 55 years old. 11 years and nearly 8 months had passed since the collapse in Turin, 11 years of silence, of absence while being present, of a kind of living death. The actual death was almost a formality, the body finally catching up to the mind's departure. The funeral was held in Raaken, the village where he was born, in the churchyard next to the church where his father had been pastor. It was a Christian funeral with all the rituals he had spent his life attacking. Prayers to a God he had declared dead, hymns praising a faith he had called the greatest corruption in human history, a burial in consecrated ground meant to await resurrection he had dismissed as fantasy. The irony was complete. But he was beyond knowing it, and the family who arranged it were simply doing what seemed proper, following the conventions of their culture and their faith. He was buried next to his father, the pastor who had died when Friedrich was 4, and the inscription on the gravestone was simple. His name and dates, nothing about his work or his ideas, just the bare facts of birth and death. And then the work began its true life, freed from the complications of its creator's presence, available to be read and interpreted and argued over without the possibility of authorial clarification. In Germany, in the first decades of the 20th century, Nietzsche became a major cultural force. Artists read him and found justification for breaking with tradition. Expressionist painters, atonal composers, experimental writers all claimed Nietzsche as inspiration, finding in his attacks on conventional morality and his celebration of creativity permission to transgress boundaries. Political thinkers across the spectrum read him and found support for their positions. Anarchists emphasized his individualism and his attacks on the state. Socialists emphasized his critique of bourgeois morality and his vision of human transformation. Nationalists emphasized his praise of strength and his critique of decadence. And of course, the emerging Nazi movement claimed him most aggressively, pointing to passages about the Übermensch, about the will to power, about the need to overcome the herd, and reading these as endorsement of their racial ideology and their cult of violence. This appropriation by the Nazis has haunted Nietzsche's reputation ever since. When the Third Reich fell in 1945 and the world learned the full extent of its crimes, the death camps, the genocide, the industrial murder of millions, anything associated with Nazi ideology became tainted. Nietzsche's name was tainted by association, not because he had actually advocated anything resembling Nazi policies, but because the Nazis had claimed him and because Elizabeth's distortions had made that claim easier. 4 years after the war, serious philosophy departments were reluctant to teach Nietzsche. He was seen as dangerous, as somehow implicated in the catastrophe. The very words he had used, Übermensch, will to power, master morality, had been so thoroughly contaminated by Nazi usage that they seemed to carry fascism within them. But this didn't hold up to careful reading. Scholars who actually studied the texts, who read them in German and attended to context and argument rather than isolated phrases, found a thinker far more complex and far less amenable to Nazi ideology than the popular image suggested. Walter Kaufmann, a German Jewish refugee who became a professor at Princeton, devoted much of his career to recovering the real Nietzsche from the Nazi distortions. His translations and commentaries, published from the 1950s onward, showed systematically how the Nazi readings violated the texts, how Nietzsche had explicitly and repeatedly attacked the very positions the Nazis attributed to him. Nietzsche despised anti-Semitism, calling it a mendacious race swindle, and breaking with friends and colleagues over their anti-Jewish views. He despised nationalism, particularly German nationalism, which he saw as provincial and culturally destructive. He despised mass movements and the subordination of individuals to collective purposes. He despised state power and militarism. The idea that this thinker somehow anticipated or endorsed Nazism required ignoring vast portions of his work and distorting the rest. Kaufmann's work helped rescue Nietzsche for serious philosophy, and by the 1960s and 70s he was being read widely again in universities, but now with more careful attention to what he actually wrote. And new generations of philosophers found in him resources for understanding the contemporary world. The existentialists had already drawn on him. Sartre's insistence that existence precedes essence, that we must create our own meaning in an absurd universe, was deeply Nietzschean even when Sartre didn't acknowledge the debt. Camus' confrontation with the absurd, his image of Sisyphus endlessly rolling the boulder uphill and finding happiness in the struggle itself, was a direct engagement with Nietzsche's thought. Heidegger's analysis of Western metaphysics as a history of forgetting being, though expressed in very different language, shared Nietzsche's sense that the entire philosophical tradition had gone astray from the beginning. But it was the postmodern thinkers, Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze and others, who most thoroughly engaged with Nietzsche's methods and insights. Foucault took up Nietzsche's genealogical approach and applied it to various institutions and practices: madness, sexuality, punishment, the self. In each case, Foucault showed how what appears natural or necessary is actually historically constructed, the product of power relations rather than rational progress. This was pure Nietzsche, the method of showing that what claims to be timeless truth is actually contingent human creation. Derrida found in Nietzsche a precursor to deconstruction, the critical method that exposes the instability and self-contradiction in philosophical texts, that shows how the very language we use to make arguments undermines those arguments. Nietzsche's insistence that there are no facts, only interpretations, his perspectivism, his recognition that metaphors shape thought in ways philosophers usually ignore, all this anticipated deconstructive reading. And beyond academic philosophy, Nietzsche's influence spread through culture more broadly. Psychology absorbed his insights about unconscious motivation, about the role of drives and instincts beneath conscious thought, about the ways we deceive ourselves about our own motives. Freud acknowledged Nietzsche as a precursor, saying that Nietzsche had anticipated many of psychoanalysis's discoveries through introspection and philosophical analysis. The concept of sublimation, the idea that aggressive or sexual drives can be channeled into creative or intellectual activity, is essentially Nietzschean. The recognition that civilization requires repression of instincts, that culture is built on renunciation, is there in Nietzsche's work before Freud systematized it. Literary criticism adopted Nietzschean suspicion, the practice of looking beneath surface meanings to power dynamics and hidden assumptions. Political theory, particularly critical theory, used Nietzschean genealogy to analyze how power operates, how knowledge claims serve interests, how moral language obscures domination. In contemporary culture, we live in a world that Nietzsche both predicted and helped create. The decline of religious authority, the fragmentation of shared moral frameworks, the sense that values are choices rather than discoveries, this is the world after God's death. The therapeutic culture, where meaning and fulfillment are sought through self-development and authentic expression rather than through conformity to external standards. This reflects Nietzschean individualism, even if most people seeking therapy have never read a word of Nietzsche. The emphasis on creativity and self-expression in education and child-rearing, the idea that the goal is to help each person become who they uniquely are rather than molding them to fit a predetermined role. This is Nietzschean, the imperative to become who you are. The suspicion of grand narratives, the postmodern awareness that all stories are told from particular perspectives serving particular interests. This is Nietzsche's perspectivism become common sense among educated people. But we also see the problems he diagnosed. The nihilism, the sense that nothing really matters if there are no absolute foundations. The last men he described in Zarathustra, people who have abandoned great aspirations and settled for comfort and entertainment, who blink at any demand for effort or sacrifice. This looks eerily like consumer culture, where meaning is sought in commodities and experiences that ultimately satisfy nothing because they address no deep need. The prevalence of ressentiment, the politics of grievance where groups define themselves by their victimization and their resentment of those with power. Nietzsche would have recognized this immediately, though he would not have aligned with either side of contemporary political divides. Both the right's resentment of elites and the left's emphasis on structural oppression would have struck him as expressions of ressentiment, ways of avoiding the harder task of self-creation and affirmation. The question remains whether Nietzsche's philosophy offers a way through these problems or simply describes them. Can human beings actually create values, actually affirm life fully, actually become Übermenschen? Or is this an impossible ideal that serves mainly to make us aware of our failures? Nietzsche seems to have thought it was possible but rare, that most people would not achieve it, that perhaps it required exceptional circumstances and capacities. He used himself as an example, though with irony and awareness of the paradox. The sick man prescribing health, the isolated man advocating self-affirmation, the suffering man preaching yes-saying to life. The collapse in Turin raises the question whether even he could bear what he prescribed. If the philosopher of affirmation ended in breakdown, what hope is there for the rest of us? But perhaps this is the wrong question. Perhaps the value of Nietzsche's thought is not that it provides a program anyone can follow but that it clarifies the situation we are in, that it shows with brutal honesty what the death of God means and what might be required to live well in its aftermath. We can accept his diagnosis without accepting all his prescriptions. We can learn from his method, the genealogical unmasking of values, the attention to psychology and power, the suspicion of comforting falsehoods, without adopting his goals. We can appreciate his courage in thinking without limits while recognizing that thinking without limits may have contributed to his destruction. The image that remains most powerful, the one that seems to capture something essential about Nietzsche's life and thought, is that moment in Turin, the philosopher throwing his arms around the beaten horse. It's an image of overwhelming compassion, of identification with suffering, of protest against cruelty. And it came at the moment of breakdown, as if the armor of philosophy finally cracked and what emerged was not the Übermensch but simply a human being who could not bear to witness suffering without responding. There's something deeply moving about this, something that complicates the harsh individualism of his published philosophy. The man who wrote against pity, who argued that compassion for the weak weakens the strong, who insisted on hardness and strength. This man collapsed weeping over a horse being beaten. Perhaps it reveals the cost of his philosophy, the tension between what he thought we should be and what he actually was. He was not superhuman. He was extraordinarily sensitive, capable of being hurt by ideas and experiences that others shrugged off, and he developed his philosophy partly as armor against this sensitivity, a way of hardening himself against pain. The attacks on pity may have been directed partly at himself, at his own tendency toward compassion that he saw as weakness. The celebration of strength may have been compensation for bodily weakness. The insistence on affirmation may have been the battle cry of someone fighting against despair. This doesn't invalidate the philosophy, but it contextualizes it, reminds us that philosophy is always written by human beings with particular bodies and histories and struggles, not by pure reason contemplating truth from nowhere. We are left with texts and with history. The texts remain powerful, disturbing, provocative, capable of changing how we think about morality and truth and the meaning of human life. The history remains tragic, a brilliant mind destroyed at the peak of its productivity, ideas distorted by those claiming to honor them, a life that contained extraordinary achievement and extraordinary suffering bound together inextricably. We cannot separate the achievement from the suffering, cannot wish away the illness and the loneliness and imagine the philosophy emerging anyway. The darkness was not incidental to the light. The suffering was not separate from the insight. They were one thing, one life, one attempt to think honestly about what it means to be human in a universe without God or purpose or inherent meaning. In Sils Maria, where Nietzsche spent summers walking and thinking and writing Zarathustra, there is still the lake in the mountains and the rock where he claimed to have conceived eternal recurrence. Tourists visit. The village has changed, there are hotels now, ski lifts, modern infrastructure, but the landscape remains largely as it was. The mountains rise as they have for millions of years. The lake reflects them as it always has. The seasons cycle through their changes. And sometimes visitors stand by that rock and try to imagine what it was like to have that thought, to conceive of all of time as circular, all of life repeating eternally, and to take that thought not as horror but as test. Could you will this return? Could you love your life enough to want it again exactly as it was, every detail, every pain, every failure, every moment of joy and every moment of suffering, all of it coming around again and again forever? It's an impossible thought to fully grasp, let alone affirm. But as a thought experiment, as a way of asking yourself whether you truly affirm your life, it has tremendous power. It strips away all hope of things being different, all fantasy of escape to another world or another life. This is the life you have. Can you say yes to it? Not yes but, not yes if, just yes. Nietzsche thought this was the ultimate test of life affirmation, the ultimate overcoming of nihilism. If you can will eternal recurrence, you have achieved something remarkable, a kind of amor fati, love of fate, that accepts everything without complaint or wish for it to be otherwise. Whether he himself achieved this is unknowable. The collapse suggests perhaps not, that the burden of his own thought proved too heavy. Or perhaps the collapse had nothing to do with thought, was simply biological breakdown that would have happened regardless. The body fails. This is not a moral failure or a philosophical one. It's just what happens to organisms. The tragedy is that it happened when it did, cutting short the work, leaving ideas unfinished, preventing the full elaboration of insights that were still developing. But perhaps it's also true that what we have is enough, that the books he completed contain what was essential, that the fragments and notebooks add texture but not fundamentally new directions, that the arc from the birth of tragedy to Ecce Homo is complete enough. His influence continues to spread in unexpected ways. Contemporary life coaches and self-help authors, often without knowing the source, repeat Nietzschean themes. Become who you are, create your own values, embrace challenge and suffering as opportunities for growth. Fitness culture's emphasis on pushing limits, on becoming stronger, on viewing weakness as something to overcome, this has Nietzschean resonance. The entrepreneurial ideal of self-creation, of the individual as startup building themselves into something remarkable, this is Nietzschean individualism adapted to capitalism. Not all of these adaptations would please Nietzsche. Many of them trivialize his thought, turn profound philosophy into self-help clichés, miss the darkness and danger in his ideas. But they testify to his cultural presence, the way his concepts have seeped into common discourse even among people who have never read him. In academic philosophy, Nietzsche remains central, endlessly debated and reinterpreted. New books about him appear every year, new theories about what he really meant, new applications of his ideas to contemporary problems. Was he a nihilist or an opponent of nihilism? Did he believe in truth or deny its existence? Was he a relativist or did he hold that some perspectives are better than others? Did he advocate a kind of moral elitism or was he attacking all morality? The debates continue because the texts are genuinely ambiguous, written in aphoristic and literary styles that resist single interpretations, filled with provocations and paradoxes and apparent contradictions. This is partly deliberate. Nietzsche wanted to provoke thought rather than provide answers, wanted readers to struggle with his ideas rather than accept them passively. But it also reflects the fact that he was working out these ideas as he wrote, experimenting, trying out positions, seeing where they led. The death of God as cultural phenomenon continues to unfold. In Western Europe, church attendance has declined to the point where Christianity is a minority practice. In the United States, the rise of the nones, people who claim no religious affiliation, represents the fastest growing religious category. The moral authority that religious institutions once held has largely evaporated. When people think about ethics, they typically appeal to harm and fairness and rights, not to divine command or scriptural authority. This is exactly the situation Nietzsche predicted. The question he posed is what happens next. Does secular humanism provide adequate foundations for morality and meaning? Or is it, as he suggested, just Christianity without God, still operating on Christian assumptions about human equality and compassion and universal values, assumptions that make no sense without the theological framework that originally supported them? This is not an easy question, and different thinkers answer it differently. Some argue that humanism works fine, that we can ground ethics in human well-being and rational deliberation without needing God. Others argue that Nietzsche was right, that secular humanism is unstable, that without transcendent foundations the values it celebrates, equality, human rights, compassion, will eventually erode because they conflict with human nature as it actually is, with the will to power, with the fact that people are not equal in ability or virtue or any other meaningful sense. Still others argue that we need new myths, new narratives that can provide meaning and values without claiming literal truth, that the death of God requires creative response not just rational ethics. This last position is perhaps closest to Nietzsche's own, his call for the creation of new values, for artists and philosophers who can shape culture in the absence of religious foundations. But the creation of new values is harder than it sounds. It's one thing to critique Christianity, to show its contradictions and its life-denying elements. It's another thing to actually construct an alternative that people can live by, that provides meaning and community and ritual and all the things religion traditionally provided. Nietzsche tried to do this in Zarathustra, creating a kind of secular scripture, but it's telling that no one actually treats Zarathustra the way people treat the Bible or the Quran, as a guide to living. It's read as philosophy or literature, admired for its insights and its language, but it doesn't function as scripture. Perhaps this is inevitable. Perhaps values cannot be created deliberately the way Nietzsche imagined but must emerge organically from communities and traditions over long periods of time. Perhaps the very project of revaluing all values is misconceived, because values are not things that can be chosen but are embedded in practices and forms of life that we inherit and modify gradually rather than revolutionary. We are left, then, with questions more than answers, which may be exactly what Nietzsche intended. He called himself a philosopher with a hammer, but the hammer was for sounding out idols, for testing whether supposedly solid foundations were actually hollow. He destroyed more than he built. He showed convincingly, at least to many readers, that traditional morality rests on questionable foundations, that the values we inherited from Christianity and Greek philosophy are neither natural nor neutral but represent particular interests and perspectives. He showed that truth is harder to achieve than we like to think, that our beliefs are shaped by unconscious drives and social forces we barely understand. He showed that suffering is not something to be explained away but something to be faced honestly. These are permanent contributions, insights that cannot be unlearned once grasped. Whether the positive vision, the Übermensch, the creation of new values, the affirmation of eternal recurrence, is achievable or even coherent remains contested. But perhaps that's not the most important question. Perhaps what matters is the example of thinking without limits, of refusing comforting falsehoods no matter how harsh the truth, of taking responsibility for one's own life and values rather than deferring to authority. Nietzsche lived this way at tremendous cost. The cost was isolation, poverty, illness, madness, and an early death. But the achievement was real, a body of work that permanently altered Western thought, that made certain forms of intellectual dishonesty harder to maintain, that opened possibilities for thinking about human life and value that hadn't existed before. The final word might be given to that moment in Turin, not because it resolves anything but because it complicates everything in necessary ways. The philosopher who preached hardness showed compassion. The thinker who analyzed everything broke down. The man who insisted on saying yes to life could not finally bear it. These contradictions don't discredit the philosophy. They humanize it. They remind us that philosophy is not handed down from on high but emerges from struggle, from human beings trying to make sense of their experience, trying to find ways to live that feel honest and meaningful. Nietzsche struggled harder than most, thought more courageously than most, suffered more than most. And he left us books that continue to challenge and disturb and inspire, that continue to pose questions we still haven't answered, about who we are and who we might become, about what we value and why, about what it means to live well in a world without God or inherent meaning. Thank you for staying with this journey through a life and a legacy that continue to shape how we understand ourselves and our world. If these explorations matter to you, if this kind of sustained engagement with ideas and history resonates, the subscribe button and the like button are both there, both helpful in allowing this work to continue and to reach others who might value it. The conversation about Nietzsche, about what his life and work mean, continues. It continues in universities and in books and in discussions among people trying to think seriously about the questions he raised. And it continues in the quiet moments when anyone confronts the fundamental questions. What do I believe? Why do I believe it? How should I live? What gives my life meaning? These are Nietzsche's questions, though they're also everyone's questions, the questions that human consciousness inevitably poses to itself once it reaches a certain level of self-awareness. His contribution was to ask them without flinching, to pursue answers without accepting easy comfort, to live the questions as fully as any human being has ever done. The cost was terrible. The achievement was extraordinary. Both are part of the same story, the same life, the same courageous and tragic attempt to philosophize with a hammer in a world where all the old certainties had become hollow.